Usually by this time in the semester I compliment you for being here because the weather is so nice, but I guess we'll have to wait another couple of weeks for that. We have a couple of short reminders as opposed to announcements, and that is that next week in section you will be getting the prompt for your second midterm. Your first midterms will be handed back this week, tomorrow in my two sections, and then Thursday in Barbara's section and my other section. The prompt will come just in time for some of you to save yourselves. The other thing is we would like you to watch very carefully, watch your email, because there are a lot of events planned for the month of April by the Human Rights Club, and we also are looking forward to the appearance in this venue of Jerry Fowler, who's the director of the Committee on Conscience. Next week, however, our speaker will be our own Barbara Lesh McCaffrey, who's going to speak to you about post-Holocaust writing, and there are readings in your reader that I think you find very, very interesting. Do you have any other?
It will make more sense if you've read them before you come
Yes.
to lecture, because I'll assume that you will have already at least read everything through.
Okay, but on to today's lecture, and that is, it's entitled An Uncommon Friendship. You had some reading out of the book that Fritz and Bernie Rossner have written in collaboration, and we're very excited to also have with us today the stylistic editor, Sally Patterson-Tubak, who will introduce Fritz and Bernie to you. So without any delay, I give you Sally. Careful.
If I tripped over the wire, it would be a real spectacular beginning. Right. Thank you very much, Myra and Barbara and Sonoma State for inviting us today. It's our pleasure to be here. We were here once before, and we're really proud of all of you for this great event and for all of your efforts in teaching the Holocaust. Is that a good sound level? Can you hear back there okay? No? Yes? Okay, that's a yes. Thank you. I'm a freelance writer, and as Myra mentioned, I was a stylistic editor, kind of the prose doctor. My husband, Fritz, has kind of an academic accent, and sometimes Bernie, in his writing, has something of a legal accent, so there was a little bit of work to be done there, and it was my great pleasure. Although I'm neither German background nor Jewish, I studied German literature at UC Berkeley. I was interested in music already at a relatively early age, and wondered how a culture could produce such wonderful music. Also, later on I learned a lot about German literature, how an enlightenment in Germany could produce writings by a tolerant, enlightened writer like Lessing, Schiller, how a culture could produce such positive things at the same time that culture, although Hitler was Austrian, but the general culture could produce a Hitler and a Holocaust. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to study German. One of the most important things for me in working on this book was to be a part of bringing back to life the murdered family of our friend Bernie Rossner. He's the sole survivor in his family, and he lost everything when he was deported from rural Hungary. He's a man without memorabilia, that is, he has no documents, no birth certificate, no passport from that time. He has no letters, between his family members, no locket of hair from a family member. Everything was gone, and that included any trace of his family, any documented records of his family. So in working on this book and having a part in it, it was a privilege to me and a moving experience to be able to have a part in bringing back to life on the pages of the book his family's life. Otherwise, their stories, if he hadn't told them at one point to my husband, they would have been lost. So in this book, there's a little bit of his family brought back to life, insofar as you can do that in a text. Bernie, just to give you a couple of facts about his life, was born in 1932 in Budapest, but he grew up in a small village called Tub in rural Hungary, southwest Hungary. After he survived the war, he has an amazing story. He was a refugee in Europe, and he was eventually adopted, brought to America by a very wealthy American. He may tell you about this. He had an immense change of fortune and came to the United States at the age of 16. Those of you who haven't studied the book carefully may not know who's who at this point, so I'd like to ask, since they're kind of the same size and age and everything, for the real Bernie Rosner to please stand up. The other half of this double memoir is the story of my husband, Fritz, and you've probably figured out who that is. He was born in San Francisco. You may not believe that when you hear his accent, but it's true. However, he was raised in Nazi Germany. His father decided to return to Germany in 1933, taking 3-year-old Fritz and Fritz's mother with him. So his father then became a member of the Nazi Party, and Fritz experienced the war in Germany. It wasn't until after the war in 1949 that he returned to the United States. He was able to, because of his birth, having been born in the United States, he could renounce his German citizenship and regain and assume his American citizenship and return to the States. And he then studied at UC Berkeley and became a professor. And I won't say more about the details of their lives now because you should hear that from them. I'll just say that the book, this is our second visit to Sonoma State, and we've been to a number of wonderful places talking about the book, and the book has been translated into German, Dutch, and Italian. We had a wonderful tour in Germany, and the book was very well received there, and there's been a documentary film made that interviews Fritz and Bernie and another woman who was half Jewish, half German, and survived the war in Germany. The name of the film is called Reconcile. And if anyone's interested, I can give you information about how to obtain a copy. And there's also, if you're not aware of it, a website that might be interesting to some of you, and that's simply www.uncommonfriendship.com. Okay, without delaying this any further, as Myra so nicely said, I'm going to ask Bernie to come to the podium.
You can hear me all? Thanks to all of you for inviting us to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us and hopefully ask questions. I think this kind of a program, the most important part of a program like this is to be able to answer questions that come to mind of, I'm sure, a very perceptive and intelligent bunch like you. And I want to point out and also emphasize that no question is out of bounds. If I don't know the answer, if I can't answer, I will say so, but I hope there will be questions. By far the greatest reward that has come our way as a result of the book has been the outpouring of goodwill and friendship from friends and strangers alike. While the early part of my life was dominated by turmoil, upheaval, and horror, most of the latter part of it was spent under slightly more benign circumstances, practicing law in California. The fact that I chose the law as a career is due to a number of reasons, but there is little question in my mind that after witnessing the breakdown of the basic norms of civilized behavior and the repudiation of decency, tolerance, and human dignity, I was strongly drawn to a profession which, ideally at least, holds up as its goals the values that were so brutally trampled upon by the perpetrators of the Nazi atrocities. During recent years, on September 11 in this country, and continuing on in other parts of the world up to the present, humanity has once again come face to face with evil. I believe that the subject and theme of our book are particularly appropriate and opportune for this time of uncertainty and upheaval. One point of relevance in my mind is that these recent events, just as the centerpiece event of our story, demonstrate that hate and fanaticism can and have done more harm to humanity than the more conventional criminal motives of greed or self-gratification. It is a sad but true fact that the criminals and terrorists who are carrying out the current atrocities, just as the psychopaths who conceived and implemented the horrors of the Holocaust, were somehow able to convince themselves that they were pursuing some just or righteous cause. To the extent that our story and our book contributes to the concept that humanity, decency, and friendship can redeem and heal, I feel we have accomplished everything and more that we could have possibly have hoped for. There's another theme in our story that I believe is highly relevant to the recent explosions of hatred and violence. This is the need to be on guard against tendencies that have, since September 11, on occasion manifested themselves, of singling out a particular group for acts of harassment and worse just because they were members of the same group or nationality that have committed or are committing the crimes. If there is one thing that could harm our country more than the acts of the terrorists, it is to permit ourselves to sink into the abyss of bigotry and hatred, and this is the time for people of goodwill to speak out against those dangerous and frightening tendencies. I have an abiding love for books and literature, and a passage from a poem came to my mind almost the instant that I first saw those TV images in New York that will be forever seared in our memories. It is a poem from Edgar Allan Poe called "The City by the Sea," and a stanza of it goes like this. Resignedly beneath the sky, the melancholy waters lie. So blend the turrets and shadows there that all seem pendulous in air, while from a tall tower in the town, death looks gigantically down. My many friends, my 3 children, and my own conscience have long urged that I tell my story. That I have not done so until relatively recently is due to a number of reasons, including a rather busy career and, frankly, having been endowed by nature with more than my fair share of a tendency to procrastinate. That I finally got around to doing so also is due to a number of reasons. First, having passed my 73rd birthday, I'm mindful that the end is much nearer than the beginning, that time is running out. Second, when one is young, it was certainly true in my case, one tends to concentrate on the present. For most of my adult life, I prided myself that I traveled with a minimum of baggage. I realize now that this was one of the mechanisms I adopted to cope with the past. But as the years advance, the realization becomes clear that the past is an integral part of one's life and personality, and that the human experience cannot be fully lived and understood without fitting the past into the mosaic of the whole. Third, while I'm not particularly conscious of failing memory, it seems logical to assume, and certainly part of the biological process, that memory fades with time, and it stands to reason that I will remember more today than some years further down the line. The upshot of all these reflections was a decision to finally tell my story. When I was finally ready to do so, a series of coincidences, which in their own way are as unique and fascinating as any other aspect of my life, brought it about that I met and made friends with a man by the name of Fritz, whose background and history could not have been more different than mine. While I was a Jew and a survivor of Auschwitz, Fritz was raised in wartime Germany. His father was a Nazi officer, and Fritz himself, in his early youth, was a member of the Jungvolk, the Cub Scout equivalent of the Hitler Youth. By the time we met in the early 1980s, about 40 years following the end of the World War II, we had become Americans. We both accepted the principle that you are responsible for your own actions and not for those of your father or other members of your nation or race. Over the years, we formed a friendship. We discovered that we both had fascinating stories to tell, and we decided to tell our stories together. The result is the book, An Uncommon Friendship, which, as Sally indicated, has enjoyed a fair degree of success and notoriety. And that is, of course, the main reason why we are here. The rest of what I have to tell you is telling you something about myself, where I came from, what I went through, and how I ended up where I did. I was born 73 years ago, in 1932, in a smallish town by the name of Tub in rural Hungary. For the first 12 years of my life, I had a basically normal and happy childhood. An important part of my personality and makeup was shaped by the rigor and discipline of a Jewish Orthodox upbringing and a sensitive and literate mother. Both of these influences imbued me with an abiding love and respect for books and learning. Anti-Semitism was certainly not unknown in Hungary, and it existed in a good measure in our village, going back as far as I can remember. It was institutional in terms of laws that restricted the freedom of Jews from practicing certain professions or owning land, and limiting the number of Jews who could be admitted to law, medical, and other professional schools. It was also personal in terms of Jews being bullied and held up to contempt by a substantial segment of the population, not by any means by all of them, but by those who followed and were of the ideas and concepts of fascism and its various shapes and permutations. But Hungarian anti-Semitism was not the virulent and deadly doctrine of racism and extermination as preached and practiced by Hitler and his thugs, and anti-Semitic undercurrents running through Hungarian political and cultural life did not disturb what I considered and remember as being essentially a happy and tranquil childhood. All this changed with dramatic suddenness on a very specific date, March 19, 1944, relatively late in the course of World War II. I remember the day very well. I was on my way home from a study session in preparation for my upcoming bar mitzvah, when a neighbor woman asked me if I had heard the news. When I asked what news, she told me that the Germans had taken over the country and the government. Within the time available here, I will not go into the details of why this happened at that late stage in the war, but if the time permits and people are interested, I'll be glad to explain it. The effects of the Nazi takeover on the Jews of Hungary were immediate and disastrous. I will limit my account to what happened to me, to my family, and to the Jewish community of Tub. Within days following the takeover, the stream of anti-Jewish edicts began. Jews could not travel without specific permission. Soon they could not travel at all. Prominent families in the community, as well as those suspected of subversive activities or associations, began to disappear. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear a prominent yellow star on their outer clothing. By mid-May, all Jews were herded in a ghetto. My family was lucky in this respect. Our home was within the area that was designated as part of the ghetto. But our 3-room home, instead of just housing my immediate family, also became home for numerous relatives, as I recall between 18 to 20, whose homes were outside the ghetto boundaries. The end of the Jewish community in Tub came during the latter part of June 1944. On 24 hours' notice, we were ordered to be ready for departure from our homes with no more than 1 suitcase per person. 3 images stand out in my mind from the day on which we were marched down the main street of Tub to the unused brickyard next to the railroad station. The first was the attitude and behavior of the non-Jewish inhabitants. A few of them were out on the street and made comments like, "Well, you Jews are finally getting what is coming to you." But the majority of the population went up into their homes, shut their doors and windows, and basically ignored the marching down of their fellow citizens, the main street of their hometown. The second image was at the school on the way to the station, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation at being stripped naked in a crowded room and hand-searched by Nazi thugs. The third was at the brickyard, with only bare earthen floor for accommodations, where an elderly woman, standing up to recite her Sabbath prayers, was clubbed bloody and unconscious by one of the guards. From Tub, we were shipped to a collection point about 50 miles away, where we were unloaded onto a large open field. There, we were joined by approximately 7,000 to 10,000 others collected from other ghettos in that part of Hungary. From there, during the first week of July 1944, we were loaded into cattle cars, between 50 to 60 men, women, and children per car, headed for Auschwitz. We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on approximately July 7. We tried to reconstruct the dates from a 1944 calendar as we were putting the book together. I remember it was a Friday. By the time the sliding door of the freight car, which remained locked throughout the 5-day journey, was opened, there were at least a half dozen corpses in the car and many more whose minds became unhinged. On the train platform at Auschwitz, this was Auschwitz-Birkenau, there was brutality, chaos, and confusion. But my immediate family, my mother, my father, my younger brother, and I were still together. The first thing that happened was an announcement on the loudspeaker that all those in charge of each cattle car were to report somewhere. My father was designated as in charge of the car, though what he could do was beyond me. In any event, hearing the command, he left us, and I never saw him again. The next thing that happened was an announcement that men and women should separate because showers would be given. By this time, my mother became quite frightened and insisted that we 2 boys stay with her. Being a 12-year-old, I said I was not about to take a shower with a bunch of women. She didn't argue with me, but her last words to me were, "Whatever you do, stick with your little brother." She left us, and I never saw her again. Next, we were lined up, the males, the remaining, were lined up, and at the head of the line were 2 SS men. They didn't wear white coats, as some of the movies showed. They were wearing SS uniforms. And as each person in the line came up to them, these officers looked this person over and sent them either to the right or the left. I didn't realize it at the time, of course, but those who were fit to work were sent to the right. Those who were too old, too young, sick, or otherwise unfit to work were sent to the left. My brother, who was just a little over 10, was ahead of me in the line. He came up to the SS men, and one of them, without even wasting his time. He just pointed to the left. Heeding back to my mother's admonition that I should stick with my little brother, I followed him. I was about 3 steps past the Nazi when he kind of reached back and grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and pulled me back and shoved me to the right. To this day, I do not know why he did this. Was he angry at me because I made my own decision? Or did he look at me and say, well, marginally, this one may possibly be able to do some work. There will be further tests and selections down the line, and if they find that he's not fit to work, they'll get rid of him then. In any event, that shove from the left to the right made the difference between my surviving that day and the rest of my family ending up in the gas chamber before the day was over. My ordeal obviously did not end with that fateful shove. Every day for the next 10 months until my liberation by the Americans during the first week of May 1945 was a battle for survival. That battle took several forms. At first in Auschwitz, it was a matter of trying to avoid being sent to the gas chambers. This was because even though I survived that initial screening process, I kept flunking the physicals that the prisoners were subjected to in order to qualify for a permanent work assignment. By mid-September of 1944, I realized that most of those remaining in my barracks consisted of the old, the sick, and those like me too young to be selected for work. At that point, in a desperate move that is described in the book, I managed to get into a transport out of Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. From then on, my battle for survival was mostly a matter of fighting and trying to survive hunger, cold, brutal beating, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and almost any other privation known to man. I suspect that most of you in this room have seen pictures of the cadaver-like creatures that emerged from the concentration camps upon liberation. I was one of them. Just to give you an idea what one day was like, not in Auschwitz, but in this place where you were not purposely sent to be killed. Our wake-up call came about 6:30 in the morning. The only place that you could clean up and get water was one kind of a common faucet where people grabbed a little bit of water to put on their faces. Within 15 minutes, you had to be out, whether it was warm or cold, whether it was snowing, raining, or otherwise, and waited for the daily appel, or the morning appel, the roll call. Sometimes you stayed out there waiting in line for more than an hour before the Nazi showed up and the prisoner in charge of the barracks reported who was present, who was not, and who was in sick bay, whatever. Then came breakfast, which consisted of a lukewarm brown liquid, which went by the name of coffee, and that's all. The midday meal was ladled out as a soup made out of dried beets, with some grease and occasionally some maggots floating on top. And you were given a bowl of that, and that was your lunch. In the evening, you were given a piece of bread that was about roughly, initially it started out being about 1/4 of a kilo or about 1/2 pound, but as conditions became more strained and supplies ran short, it became not much more than a slice, and occasionally you got a piece of butter or margarine, not butter, but margarine, or some jam or a piece of liverwurst. That was basically what you lived on. During the 10 months I was in the camp, I didn't have one glass of milk. I had one apple core when we were being driven to one of our work assignments. A civilian woman threw down, presumably deliberately, and I managed to pick up and chew on it. That was the only fruit I had. Very briefly, I will tell you how I ended up where I am, how a chance encounter in the summer of 1945 changed and gave new direction to my life. By that time, with the war in Europe over, I was in a refugee camp in Italy in the town of Modena. I was alone, just over 13 years old, ragged and hungry. There were thousands of kids like me hustling for an extra piece of bread, or if we were really lucky, some candy or a piece of chewing gum. The only source of those goodies were the American soldiers who were stationed near our camp. So naturally, I spent much of my time hanging out near where the Americans were billeted. I was standing there one day looking for a hustling opportunity. A jeep drove up with 4 GIs and 4 duffel bags. I immediately ran up to the jeep and offered my services as a porter. One of the GIs smiled and pointed at one of the duffel bags, which I then picked up and followed him. Later, my employer told me that the bag was almost as big as I was, and all he could see was the bag and my bare heels clicking away underneath with great energy. I deposited the duffel bag in the room, and we tried to communicate. We discovered that broken German was our only common language. I very briefly told him my situation, and he was visibly moved. For the next 5 days, which all of the time that he was there, after he finished his assignments and work, he would pick me up in the late afternoon from the camp, take me to movies or to a restaurant, things that I've never had before. There's a picture of us in the book showing the soldier and the urchin taken by a street photographer. He was moved from this area, from Modena, about 5 days later, and I too was moved to a orphanage which had a much better conditions. And we started corresponding. The upshot of the correspondence was that in the late fall of 1945, after he was demobilized, the war was over, and he was sent home and became a civilian, and he talked it over with his wife. He sent me a letter, and I still have a copy of that letter in German, asking me if I wanted to come to the United States and be a member of his family. This is a pretty incredible story, but even more remarkable is the fact that the name of this young GI was Charles Merrill Jr., the founder of the Merrill Lynch financial empire. The rest, you might say, is history. I had about 6 months of tutoring to learn English, which was not a problem because I spoke a number of other languages. By the time I graduated from high school, I was pretty much ready to go, and ended up going to Cornell, put 2 years in the service, and went to Harvard Law School and became a lawyer. I should add that even though I had all this good fortune, I always insisted on trying to be independent, and by the time I was going to law school, I was more or less self-sufficient, among other things, because under the GI Bill, I got a check from Uncle Sam to the tune of $110 a month. Believe it or not, in those days, that was enough to pay the tuition at Harvard Law School. As you can see, things have changed since. When Fritz and I first embarked on our joint project, my intention was not to send a moral message. My intention was simply to tell my story, because I realized that I had some obligations to discharge. First and foremost was an obligation to my 3 children. As they grew up, they heard bits and pieces of the story, but never in a coherent and systematic way. More importantly, I kept the pain and emotion out of whatever I told them, and I realized now that this was more to protect myself than to protect them. I also owed an obligation to the family I lost: my mother, my father, my kid brother, my extended family. The story of the Holocaust, of how millions were murdered, has been told many times, but their own individual story has never been told. I felt that they deserved that be done, and that it was up to me to do it. I also felt that my story was a good and fascinating yarn that was worth telling, With all the horror and suffering, there were moments of tension, suspense, and adventure. The old truism that often truth is stranger than fiction applies, I believe, to many aspects of both of our stories. But even though the story was not told to send a moral message, I believe that it does so nevertheless, and it does so on several levels. The one that I believe is particularly relevant today is the ability of two individuals who come from historically different beginnings to be able to surmount the walls that could have divided them, to look beyond the conventional mindset that could have made them, if not hate, at least distrust each other, and enable them to form a friendship. Instead of being adversaries or strangers, they decided to join forces, ignore labels, and tell what I believe is a warm and inspiring story. Truth and accuracy were the principal guidelines for telling my story. By training and makeup, I'm passionately devoted to the truth. My story needs no embroidering. While the whole truth may be larger than its constituent parts, it is at least as important that each constituent part be told as accurately as humanly possible. The purpose is not to rebut the silly notion that the Holocaust never happened. Maybe I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but those who advance that notion I do not feel should even be dignified with an answer. I want the story that I tell to be true and accurate, because in the end, truth, accuracy, reason, and logic are the only reliable yardsticks by which any human experience, including the horrors of the Holocaust, can be judged. And finally, two closing points. What has happened to me since the war and what I became could not have happened in any country other than this one. For a kid from a small Hungarian backwater village who didn't wear shoes from April to September except on holidays, to end up where I did and to have experienced what I did, it could not have happened anywhere else. The person who reads the book will also see what Charles Merrill has meant to my life and to me. There is no way that I could ever begin to repay him for his generosity, kindness, and above all, courage, for taking into his home and family a ragged urchin wandering the byways of post-war Europe who could have been a totally damaged human being. By what he did to me, he has demonstrated that one single person can make a difference. Thank you very much.
Now, by a process of deduction, I'm the person from the other side of the divide. As my wife already pointed out, I was born in San Francisco, but my father, actually less for ideological convictions, but out of opportunism, he was a musician, lost his job. He decided to return to Germany in 1933. Took me along. Not so long ago, I found a letter of an uncle of mine who described our arrival back in Germany in 1933. And he said in the letter, little Fritz, that's me, didn't understand a single word of German. So I taught him his first German words, how to say Heil Hitler. So this is what you might call was the beginning of my education, both linguistically and culturally and every other way in Germany. And that's the country I grew up. My family was deeply split, as were many German families. You know, when you look at the movies that Hitler made, it looked like Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, and so on. That was, of course, true in an extent. But when you looked into the families, they usually were deeply split along political lines. My father was the Nazi. Another uncle of mine was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. My grandfather still believed in the Kaiser. And my grandmother cooked for everybody and cried a lot, as was the role of women then. So at any rate, that split family was very important to see as a kid, but I was raised by a stepmother. My mother died quite young in 1934. And she was the local blacksmith's daughter. My father needed to park me somewhere, so he married her to have somebody raise me. So I was raised then in a blacksmith shop, and this was a very simple peasant family, and they were profoundly anti-Nazi. Not after the war, during the war. They said so, told jokes about Hitler, quite openly. But the village needed a blacksmith shop. They couldn't arrest my step-grandfather. And my stepmother had a great effect on my education, and she is discussed in the book. She had two great virtues. She had civil courage. I learned very early to say no was a virtue, and I learned that. Sometimes I don't think my wife probably appreciates my saying no all the time, but that's the way it is. So to say no, even in terms of making it a dangerous thing to do. The other thing she taught me is that people with a simple background can have a great nobility, sometimes better than the rich and famous. I love to say that, by the way, in some of the venues when we talk to very, very wealthy people. I extend that point a little more to bring in a little political or social value of my own. We all do that, even if we pretend we don't. So I was raised in this split family situation and experienced the war in great detail. I happened to be quite interested in writing everything down even then. And I just recently found that I kept track of the progress of the war, every village or town that was conquered and so on. But my real education started in May of 1945, after the Americans had occupied our village. And they posted a big poster on the town hall with a picture of the Warsaw Ghetto, specifically of a deep ravine with corpses in the bottom and some still hanging on the wall. Some of you may have seen this picture. And on the top, the platform, German soldiers walk around. It seemed like a picture out of Dante's Hell. And I thought to myself, this is what we have done, or this was done in our name. This experience, as my life evolved and developed, became one of my very important part of my political convictions, of my academic work in Berkeley. So when I finally was able to come to California, as my wife pointed out, because I had citizenship, I then studied at the University of California, became a professor there, and wrote books. As we have to, and as we like to do it. But as I was a trained medievalist and folklorist, but as I went on and I got older, I was pushed and drawn back to the 20th century more and more in my teaching, to teach contemporary German culture from 1933 to the present. And I did that for years to have a critical view of Germany, but it still was academic, and it just went over it went through as academics. We have our own frame of reference. And our own frame of reference usually neutralizes the real meat of history. But we have to survive in our own way. At any rate, so as I went on with my life, I realized I wanted to write something closer to what actually happened. I could never quite had an answer for this. I wrote a journal book for the general public called German Culture since '33. But when I finally met Bernie, the opportunity arose to do a work on our past, his past, you've heard an outline, and my own. His as the center of the story, mine as a foil to his. So we collected material. I wrote the text. Bernie wanted to have it presented as in a third person. This is not unusual. You may know Eli Wiesel, whose native tongue is not French, but he wrote his original book in French, La Nuit, in order to create, I presume, just as in Bernie's case, find a medium that interferes between the experience and the actual articulation of it for other people. And so that happened in our case too. Now, there are various people who said that's a taboo. Only the survivors should really be allowed to tell their story. There's a lot of discussion about these things. There are the purists, of course, who say, yes, that's the way it's supposed to be. But as time goes on, more and more people realize, there are other periods come along, and it has to be maybe retold also in other ways. Case in point is the movie Life is Beautiful, the Italian movie. Now there's a debate about that. It's a fairy tale. I don't know whether you've seen this, but it's a very interesting movie that raises the question whether only people who have lived it can tell their story. But this is not an issue to be settled here. At any rate, to me, to do this was an incredible experience. For Bernie, it was a way also to come to grips with his own past. And I, of course, had to come to grips with my own guilt feelings about these things. What you have now this is a used copy, of course. It's a smooth product, okay? But the pain that went into writing this is no longer visible because you have to make a smooth text out of it so people buy it and read it. They want to know what we said. So anyway, but we did it, and I'm very pleased we did it. And why did I do it finally? Not only to deal with my own guilt feeling, I have a great belief in, well, first of all, tolerance. You have to be tolerant of other people not like us. But tolerance is a passive emotion. Thank God that it exists. But it's a passive. I'll let you do what you want to do, okay? Or I won't interfere. But after tolerance comes the next step, which I think is more important, and that I would call empathy. I think empathy is such an underrated virtue. It means really not just to tolerate somebody who's different, but actually try to put yourself into their lives as much as you can, is to accept them as different from yours and not project maybe your own emotions onto them. It's very important. If you learn how to do it, you will grow. You just become a bigger person, a happier person. Not only, well, maybe not always happier, but at least you become more differentiated as a person. And that happened between us. Now, Bernie's experience, I was not in the camp. So I cannot really, I would be, impossible to reproduce what he has experienced. But at least try in my language to capture in some ways with it. And Bernie and I worked very closely together, and he would correct, and then we would have conversations about it. What made it easy, some people say, how can you do this? It was, after all, maybe a more eyeball to eyeball situation. It wasn't. We were adults and we were professionals and in our own fields and so on. And we had a framework around it. We had dinner. He would tell me some of his material. I write it down. I would draft something. We have dinner, important. After dinner, of course, you have some wine with dinner, also important. Oh yeah, don't underestimate Plato's dialogues. Dialogues have to have a context. You don't just, it's not just your head talking. So after dinner, we would sit in the living room, and I would read him what I've written. And then Sally would go over after that, at that period. She came in a little after that. And then Bernie would correct, and at one point he told me something that shocked me. He said, you look very pontificating. Well, I'm a professor, of course, so I try to interpret and pontificate. So I really try to get my professorial pontifications out of it, okay? Stuff like that. So anyway, the formal aspect or the social aspect of our doing this was a very important reason for its success. And of course, and then I will read you a few passages and we open it for discussion. What was also important is the innocence with which we started it. If we had known this was going to be a book, I don't think I could have done it. It's just the total innocence. He wanted to tell his story, or he pointed out because his family. I was very challenged to try to tell my story as not only a foil to his, but to use some of my own experiences to, get into what he was doing, being picked for special Nazi camps that have similarities in structure to the concentration camps, in structure, not in content. Okay, so here I am, and so then let me just then stop my pontificating and read you a few passages from the book, because that's, after all, why we did it and why we're here. The first describes our first encounter. I felt apprehensive about the upcoming event with my wife's old schoolmate and her husband. It would have been easier to watch a documentary film or to participate in an academic discussion on the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust. This dinner for 4 could be attended by uninvited guests. Any of the dead members of his family or of mine. Perhaps my distant uncle, who had been an SS officer in charge of a refugee camp near Würzburg and hanged by the surviving inmates at the end of the war, might appear. Or perhaps my own father, in his Nazi party uniform, would join us for dinner. Or my host's father and mother, as they emerged from the ashes of the crematorium. Although the subject of concentration camps didn't come up over dinner, I couldn't help thinking about it. I noticed that Bernie had light blue eyes, words from the Todesfuge, Death Fugue, of the Jewish poet Paul Celan, a camp survivor who later committed suicide in Paris, crowded in on me. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Death is a master from Germany, his eye is blue. I repeated them several times to myself, recreating in my mind the ritual intensity with which they had repeated in the poem. As a child, I was told that I had inherited the blue eyes of my mother, who died before the war when I was 3 years old. From these self-absorbed reveries, I looked again at our dinner host and decided that perceptions were a result of the moment. Now it seemed to me that he had the upturned mouth of Frank Sinatra and could easily pass for his first cousin, if not his brother. No hint of Auschwitz there. I noted that he and I, both on the short side, were just about the same height. He was slight and wiry, while I had to watch my weight. I probably looked more Jewish, in quotes, than he did to those who saw people as stereotypes. My mind drifted to my father, who told me once of being terribly afraid of a barber in Germany who had asked if he was Jewish. My father denied it, insisting that appearances can be deceptive. But he had the feeling the barber didn't believe him and would have liked to have cut his throat with a straight-edged razor he used to shave him. The dinner conversation with a rawness escaped me for a short time, but no one seemed to notice my silence. And my free associations about blue eyes, appearances, and barbers faded away. In reality, Bernie is a year younger than I am. As it turned out, the hours passed quickly during that mild summer evening in Northern California, when the setting sun suffuses the air with a pale yellow tinge. World War II was 2 generations behind us. The past seemed far away. We stayed late to sip cognac and watched a sampling of Bernie's video collection of grand opera. The Rosners had a large screen television, and with several remote controls, Bernie could tune in the finest arias of Mozart or Verdi. Classical music enveloped the living room as we listened to excerpts from Strauss' Der Rosenkavalier. Who at our age would not be touched by the Marschallin's musings on time as a wondrous thing? Die Zeit ist ein sonderbar Ding. Wouldn't it be best for both of us to surround our pasts with a detached glow of great music? That's not what happened, because the thin blanket of suburban living couldn't hide the heaviness and the bulk of the experiences that lay underneath it, particularly Bernie's, hence the book. I would now like to read you a longer section. It's the one that I don't always read. I know it's Bernie's one of his favorites, and I think Sally already alluded to it. Indeed, to reconstruct, at least in a narrative, the story of his family was very crucial to me. The only existence these people have, there's no record of them. See, the Nazis didn't just kill the human beings, the Jews. They also killed all evidence that they ever existed. That was their idea, ultimately. So to recreate, just for once, when I tell you these passages about his family, they would just come here for one moment into this room in some little fashion and then disappear again. And that was one reason, that very important part of writing this book, to not lest we forget. I don't talk now just about the horrors. Those are recorded, but they're very abstract. but the individual, to evoke them for a moment in my narrative. So let me just read you that passage. Bear with me, it's a slightly bit longer, the other one. Louis Rosner, Bernie's father, a redhead, had an emotional side that ill-tolerated the impertinence of his eldest son. Their frequent quarrels were caused by a lack of subordination, as Bernie describes his own behavior, assuming a fatherly tone himself. At one point, Bernie's interest in learning and books got the better of it, got him into trouble. A prayer book belonging to one of the pillars of the community sat on the shelf right next to Bernie's customary seat in the synagogue. Day in and day out, Bernie coveted that marvelous leather-bound book so much that one day he stole it, took it home, tore out its pages, and deposited the cover, now devoid of its spiritual content, back in its customary place. Bernie was the prime suspect. When accused of the theft, he denied everything, prompting the owner of the book to comment sarcastically that perhaps an angel had taken it and removed its pages. The boy's insistence on his innocence gained him the nickname Angel Tralala. As the full wrath of his father was about to descend on Bernie's head, a minor religious miracle occurred. The owner of the book, the man who had dubbed him Angel Tralala, pleaded that the boy not be punished, since his transgression proved a genuine interest in reading and in matters spiritual. Thus the anger of the father was diffused, but the nickname stuck to Bernie for the remainder of his life in tub. Little Angel Tralala felt closer to his dark-haired mother, Bertha Rosner, née Schwartz, in 1893, was a spiritual bridge to Bernie's grandfather in Kiskunalash. She was a sensitive person who cried easily, and Bernie suspects that his mother was his hypochondriac with an imagined bad heart. She was the emotional font for him and his brother. An articulate storyteller, she would also who was also the inspiration for his own enduring love of books. He still remembers how beautiful her handwriting appeared in the letters she read aloud to him when he was very young. Bernie's mother was also an expert seamstress and a good cook. She baked delicious sweets, cinnamon swirls, jellied rolls, and the kind of cakes that showed that the village of Tub and its inhabitants were not far from Vienna and its elegant pastries. Bertha Rosner instilled in her boys a sense of duty to take the straight and narrow path. This Hungarian mother employed old-fashioned educational methods in vogue all over Europe. Unadorned scare tactics. When confronted with a disobedient son, she threatened him with his gypsies who roamed the landscape. If you don't behave, we'll hand you over to the gypsies who will take you away. How many times was this admonition used to reprimand European children, and in how many languages? I remember the gypsies in my village who knocked at our front door to beg. I hid behind my grandmother's skirts, fearing that they might take me away, whether I had misbehaved or not. The very gypsy wagons that moved in and out of villages struck fear into every child, since these wandering people played a sinister role in the pedagogic arsenal of European parents. In Bernie's mother's case, this disciplinary arsenal also included the Scherenschleifer, as Bernie told me in German, the knife sharpener, who appeared periodically to sharpen the knives and scissors of the villagers. I remember that this same apparition, this quintessential stranger, outsider, wearing ragged clothes and a broad-brimmed hat, descended on my village as well. The nucleus of Bernie's family, father, mother, 2 brothers, was part of a large extended family. Bernie's mother was one of 12 siblings, and his father had 2 brothers with sizable families of their own living in Tub. There was a paternal spinster aunt who, in contrast to his maternal spinster aunt, the strict Aunt Libby of Kiskunalash, was a gentlewoman. His Uncle Willie had a limp. he also had a daughter with artistic talent, who helped Bernie with an assignment in his drawing class. Unlike his younger brother, Alexander, Bernie couldn't draw, so this cousin sketched a steam engine for him, and Bernie received a high mark for her efforts. All villagers, rich and poor, shared an everyday communal life that changed only with the seasons. In springtime, the various fruit crops were harvested, cherries first, plums later, followed by apples and pears. Walnuts developed in their soft green outer shells until ripe for picking and peeling towards the end of the summer. The threshing season started in August, first with the wheat and afterwards the rye. In midwinter, our footprints marked the snow as we carried lanterns to light the way home through the dark night. And in the morning, after a night of heavy snowfall, the village was transformed into an enchanted landscape. Timeless moments of the seasons, with no beginning and no end. These memories of the boy from Tub are also the memories of the boy from Kleinheubach. But these times came to an end. They ended for Bernie in early spring 1944, when the seasonal rhythms were replaced by the shouts of Nazis. Those harsh new voices disrupted life as the Jews of Tub had known it, and in less than 3 months ordered their deportation and extermination at Auschwitz. There, or in other camps, most of the Jews of Tub were killed. Bernie's literate mother, who thought she had a bad heart, the severe Aunt Libby of Kishkunalash, and Uncle Joe and Willie and their children, and Bernie's father, preoccupied with his work, and the nice spinster aunt of Tub, and Bernie's own little brother, Alexander, a talented drawer of horses, and, if he lived that long, the wise and learned grandfather of Kishkunalash, and the devoted Orthodox Jew from the next pew in the synagogue, whose book Bernie stole, who pleaded with Bernie's father for leniency. And there is no end to this list. The only survivor among family members, friends, and acquaintances was Angel Tralala. Now I'll read you a short passage from Bernie's days in Auschwitz. We know from documentary photographs that over the main gate of Auschwitz, the Nazis had affixed the slogan, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. In Bernie's barracks, stenciled on a rafter and adorned with colorful, kitschy flowers, inmates could read the first line of a popular German folk song, Es geht alles vorüber, everything passes. This sentimental song, one of many I learned in my youth, is still sung today in German taverns when the mood is jovial. It promises that after every December, a May will surely follow. The song is usually sung towards the end of an evening of drinking, right before in München steht ein Hofbräuhaus, when people link arms and sway back and forth in a heightened sense of solidarity. That macabre bit of interior decorating in Bernie's barracks faded at nightfall, as darkness settled in on their cramped quarters, and quite another song emerged, one composed by an inmate in Yiddish. Someone would start to sing it, then a second voice would join in. Soon most of the inmates would be singing. A few remained silent on their pallets as Bernie recalls to listen to its desperate cry for deliverance. Bernie?
This lament, this song, was in line with Central European Jewish tradition, where on occasions of both joy and sadness, where people were gathered, somebody who was good at making instant rhymes would start the first line of a song and others would pick it up. These are instant folk songs. They are not recorded. This one was never recorded, yet its words have remained in my memory, and I can recite them by heart from, almost 60-some years ago. In Yiddish it goes like this. Echo wie azoi in faravos jokstun sazoi. Wie is Vater dein Rachmones, habet mishomaim urei. From dem Himmel gib a Blick, zu den jüdischen Kinder gib Glick. Läsch aus dem Feuer, in soll es schön sein, Genick.
Now in English, oh, why and for what are you hunting us so? Where is, Father, your mercy? From heaven give a glance, to the Jewish children give a chance. Extinguish the fire, and let it be enough. The first word of this plaint, echoi, how, hauntingly evokes the cry of grief that begins the Old Testament book of Lamentations. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. And the ending echoes the medieval night watchman song that exhorted Germans to extinguish lamps and fires to prevent conflagrations from engulfing their towns. In the concentration camp, the ears of the guards keeping watch outside the barracks were closed. The plaint did not reach them, and the God the inmate invoked was deaf. Now, in conclusion, I will read you the last page of the book, not because it's the last page, because it's more or less also a plea for the new Germany. Germany has changed. They have developed a civil society that is remarkably open, and maybe we should start imitating a little bit here. Sorry for saying that. And the new generation of Germans have dealt with it in great detail, and it's a plea for them. I'm now writing another book called German Voices, Generation and Their World in Hitler's Germany, which now occupies me. But this is more or less a conclusion to the book and a plea for this new generation of Germans and a plea for your acceptance of them. Soon after the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain crumbled, the world watched the Germans celebrate the collapse of their division when the Jewish-American conductor Leonard Bernstein conducted Beethoven's Ninth Symphony not far from the ruins of Hitler's bunker. Perhaps our joy over this performance was now no more than a leap of faith, an ephemeral acte imaginaire, but one that we nevertheless embraced. Yet, is such a leap of faith justified? For why would a past moment from Bernie's story, when the dwindling group of survivors at Gunskirchen stacked up corpses to form partitions in their barracks, crowd in on me? Shortly before the Holocaust befell Europe, Freud described in his book Civilization and Its Discontents the life and death instincts as equally powerful forces. Was he right? Or can we cling instead to Thomas Mann's dictum from the Magic Mountain for guidance as an underpinning for our act of faith? For the sake of goodness and love, man shall let death have no sovereignty over his thoughts. On our last evening in Berlin, we attended a performance of Mozart's Magic Flute at the Staatsoper located on the main boulevard Unter den Linden in what used to be the center of East Berlin. Mozart's music floated in the air, a perfect symbol of freedom and order, and the story of the opera unfolded with both its dark night and its illuminating path, with its trials and its victories. During those few hours, we experienced, within the magic circle of music, the transformative powers that are inherent in all of us, if we only have the courage, faith, and luck to let them come forth to guide us. We left the opera house to say farewell to Berlin and to Germany with Sarastro's words still reverberating in our hearts. In diesen heiligen Hallen kennt man die Rache nicht. In these sacred halls, there is no room for revenge. Thanks. I sometimes read a section from the book that I don't today. What I remember very clearly is two things. I was given a primer, which was highly propagandistic against Jews, with a butcher shop, an Aryan butcher shop, all clean, and the Jewish butcher shop dirty, and so on. And I remember reading this, and just as a kid, now I remember I just was puzzled at it. I don't remember any specific emotions. But what stands out in my mind was the night of the breaking glass, the Kristallnacht. I don't know what phrase you use here. On November 8th, 9th of 1938, the violence against the Jews became very open all over Germany and in front of everybody. And I remember going to school, and an old lady I knew, a Jewish woman, came out of the schoolhouse with some of her belongings. They let her pick up some of the belongings that thugs had thrown in the street. And I looked at her and I thought, she had lost something. This woman had taken something away from her. She somehow projected a sense, she wanted to pretend nothing had happened, something obviously had happened to her, something awful. And I could see, it was disturbed me as a kid. I walked in another Jewish house was smashed. I walked into it, I was curious. I went upstairs and looked at the smashed, everything was smashed. Then I got frightened, I ran out and found in the gutter a white candle, a Jewish candle for celebration. And I picked it up and I cleaned it off and I carried it home. And it was a very mixed emotion. Was I destroying? Did I steal something or did I save something? So it was very disturbing, as it was for many Germans. The Kristallnacht was really the beginning of World War II for most Germans. There was a lot of talk right then. I remember it, my father even. That's the beginning of World War II. Now, this is it. Violence has started, and it's amazing how the war and the Holocaust belong together, if you analyze it. So in that sense, then, I had this primer, and then these personal experiences, And of course, as the war progressed, most Germans were more and more occupied with the Jews were gone. That's, of course, a story in itself. That's another chapter. You probably know about that a lot, too. But what was clear as the war went on, Germans just forgot about the Jews, quite frankly, because of everything else. It's very interesting how this is a history, how that the war really provided a cover also, in some sense, for the Nazis to hide their crime, at least in front of many people. Anyway, but this is my feeling that, and after the war, of course, I began to get to know German Jews personally here. And that was an eye-opener for me. And most Germans don't know Jews very well now because although many Jews have come back to Germany, the Russian Jews, they stay there and so on. But most Germans just don't know Jews personally. So they have these strange, abstract relationships to Jews in general. That's a long question, but Professor, I talk long-windedly. Does that give partial answer? Yeah. Okay.
A question for Ray. When all your family was in your house with you and you had like 18 or 20 people you said living with you, did you know that, did you think that was going to be the end? Did you know that things were getting worse? Or what was the feeling like in your house with all the people there?
If I understand you correctly, you want to know whether when all these things were happening, we knew what will be happening to us?
What was it like to be together?
Well, your question is what it was like when we were in a ghetto together? Is that? Well, we knew. I mean, in some respects, there were, I'm sure, and I probably just don't remember quarrels as well. But basically, it was just went without saying that you got to help each other, and at least within our family group, we basically pooled our resources. When these other folks moved into our home, they brought whatever they could in the way of food, and by then food became quite short. We shared, and we slept on the floor, and as I say, partly convenient memory. I'm sure the kids must have fought, and it's just there were at least half of those people were youngsters, but basically we knew that this had to be done, and it was done. That was true certainly at that stage. There were other stages, and by other people down through the camp, when this kind of partnership and brotherhood did not prevail. When you're down to the nitty-gritty of literally survival, it brings out both the best and the worst in people. But that did not yet happen when we were together in the ghetto. I was a willing and focused participant in that. There were two aspects to this, and I basically led my life until I told my story. I separated myself not just from my past, but I never went to Holocaust survivors conferences. I did not participate in the Spielberg living history, because I felt in some respects, because I just did not want to confront what happened. I found that now that I've talked to many, not as many survivors, because there are not that many around anymore, but their children, who says that if anything, some of their parents or whoever was in the camp were even more reticent about talking to it. So that was one reason. But another reason was to be quite honest, and one of the things that I wanted to do is tell an honest story. I felt that I have paid my dues. I was absolutely determined not to be a victim again. I was going to become an American and to be accepted. I was excluded from everything. There is a little image in the book about the celebration of what is equivalent of the 4th of July in Hungary, and I was in school at the time, and our school sent a contingent with a Hungarian flag to be in the parade, and everybody said, "You Jews are not Hungarians, you don't belong here." And this exclusion prompted me, given the basically welcoming surrounding and atmosphere in the United States, to just become part of the establishment and part of adopting the culture and the coin of the realm. And I came here in the 50s, where the success was defined in being successful, getting good grades, knowing exactly where you're going to go to school and what you're going to do afterwards. And I did all of that with a vengeance. And I hope that explains the two aspects of the. As I say, I'm not apologizing for it. I'm not bragging about it. This is my story. This is what I was.
Let me add something to this in general. You see, after the war, in Germany too, the Holocaust was not studied and discussed very much. There are very specific reasons for that. I remember in 1950, the Allies began to hire Germans to have a new army again. We needed Germans against Russia, against communism. So that for decades, it just was not the thing to talk about. It's only when after certain things happened, like the Diary of Anne Frank had a big effect in Germany. But even more so, in 1979, there was a series, the Shoah series, which really became a national kind of Oh yeah, the Holocaust series, because the Jews the Jews portrayed there were typical upper middle class European Jews. They were not Eastern European Orthodox Jews that looked different with pikes and hats and so on. So that family and their fate in camps, it just blew Germany away. They had discussions and conferences and TV shows, and then it appeared. And I think the fact that we wanted very early to have Germans on our side against the Russians helped hide it. One specific example. My father always claimed in 1947, he was in prisoner of war in England. One of the first things the British the army did, they said, which one of you had experiences in the East Front? And 3 SS officers announced that they had experiences fighting the Russians. They were whisked away in staff cars, not to be punished, no, to be promoted. So, there was that unfortunate history that much of, in general, there was hiding this fact of anyway, that's just a context a little bit.
This is a question for both of you gentlemen. Was your faith affected as a result of the Holocaust? And secondly, was it affected, if it had been originally, was it affected again as a result of writing the book?
Could you repeat your question again? I didn't quite get the question.
I would like to know whether your faith was affected by your experience.
You start that one.
Well,
Yeah, okay, you first.
I'll take it first because it's a pretty important issue in my life. First, as I indicated in my speech and my presentation, I came from a very strict Orthodox Jewish family. And one might suggest that when I ended up in the concentration camp and saw all that horror, that your faith would be shaken. How can there be a God? How can you, all those things with all of these going on? But that was not the case. Among other things, Jews are not, this was not the first time that Jews were slaughtered. It's just that they were not, it was not done probably quite that systematically, and they hung on to their faith. There's the stories of Jews being sent to the stake, burning fire, and saying the traditional prayer, God is one. And I retained my faith throughout that period, and there's little question in my mind but that holding on to that faith made a difference between my being able to survive. I did part ways. I'm no longer religious, and the change happened actually not when I came to this country. It came before then. It came when we were picked out of this refugee camp, the shabby, just bare bones kind of a place, obviously not like a concentration camp, but we went to an orphanage. And this was run by people, by then Palestinian Jews, now Israelis of course, who were members of the British Army, who formed a Jewish brigade during the Second War, who fought very valiantly in several of the battles. But at the end of the war, their mission became to gather up the remnants of the survivors and start shepherding them towards ports in southern Europe, Italy, so that they could be taken to Israel. And these people were brave, assertive people to whom their Jewishness was not a religious one. And I remembered all the things that we were told about Jews, that they're cowards, they don't know how to fight. And these were the opposite extreme. They were 180 degrees different. So they became my role models. And they did not in any sense try to brainwash me. But I became non-religious because they in effect became my role model. So by the time I came to this country, I was not really anymore a person practicing the Jewish religion.
I was raised in what you might call Protestant light. You know, you were baptized, you went every Christmas and New Year's Eve. So faith was not a major force in my early life at all. And it didn't affect me one way or the other because I did not have a pronounced religious structure, upbringing. Except I do remember the great comfort you got when the war as it got worse, you know, roaring planes overhead at night. By the way, you still have it here. Americans, let me just have a footnote here. We never see in America squadrons of fighter planes, do we? Let's say 50. You never see it here. American population isn't shown our military power in the air. You see the Blue Angels, there are 4 of them who make somersaults over San Francisco. But I still hear at night sometimes, at 3 in the morning, I hear this certain deep rumbling of planes, obviously military planes who fly someplace, probably to Iraq. So in a sense, I remember the planes coming overhead, and having religious services and the intensity of prayer to protect us from bombs that might fall. That I do remember. But then my faith basically, as a medievalist, of course, I studied Catholicism intensely and had a great deal of sympathy for that religion. Once you write books about something, you get attracted to it in some ways, but I'm not a practicing, just like Bernie. A secularist with a bad conscience.
This is for Fritz. What do you think are the steps for a country who's committed a genocide to recover and heal? For example, what Germany did that was successful, or what Japan maybe should do?
Okay.
Just talk about Japan after the Holocaust.
Well, that's such a good question. Now, what should a country do? Well, let me just first admit I don't have an answer to the question. But I would say to study history, to admit the Japanese started in their history books, start World War II after Pearl Harbor. It's not even brought up. That is the first thing. And then I have a psychological approach, as I try to point out. It's really that the more you learn about the victims your country has caused, how they were as human beings, the empathy, the idea of empathy. We should teach empathy as a subject, actually, in some fashion, to really give people a sense of the other. Not as saying, I don't understand him, therefore he's bad. And we should, but I don't know, it would take a long time. I think when we see things happening now, just beginning to shape up between Shiites and Sunnis, they're just starting, maybe. And of course, Israel and Palestine. It's a sad story. And I hang on to little stories you hear about some websites that some Jewish mothers and some Palestinian mothers try to communicate. Well, good. Maybe it has to start that way. As Bernie said, maybe it starts with individuals who get to know other people who come from that group that is being subjected to violence by your own nation. That certainly put Bernie and me together. It's a vague answer, but that's all I can give you.
I have a third question. This is for Fritz too. How did your father feel about the Jews after
Oh, yeah.
about the Holocaust?
That's a very interesting question. My father, yeah. Well, he was, of course, your fathers are interesting. Mine was particularly, I thought. Well, anyway. He was a musician in San Francisco, and of course he knew very many Jews personally. He played with them in bands and in orchestras. My father was a Nazi, but he was not anti-Semitic. Believe it or not. He just didn't have any, that had nothing to do with it for him. In fact, historians today say that anti-Semitism was not the main driving force of Nazism at all. It's the most horrible consequence of it, but it was not the main driving force of it. So he, after the war, I confronted him with this. I said, look, what about it? And he just has a ritual answer. He said, it's the worst crime ever committed. I don't think he ever felt it. It just was a ritual. He just couldn't face up. And I said, I pressed him some more. I said, they showed us in the camp when he was a prisoner of war in England, they showed us atrocities from the Auschwitz. And one of the officers said, how can they do this to us? And held his hand in front of the camera lens so they wouldn't be exposed to it. He actually used as an explanation. It hurt him to find out about it. A very strange attitude of that generation. And there are no psychological explanations for it. I firmly believe, maybe I'll step on somebody's toes here, psychology, as Freud has invented it, can't explain these camps. It's something, I think we need other categories to explain that violence. And my father's reaction, there's no simple psychological explanation either.
Join me in thanking Fritz and Bernie.